3 estates, 3 generations, 3 decades of tragedy that defied probability. The Kennedy family constructed their American empire from carefully selected properties: a coastal compound in Massachusetts, a winter palace in Florida, a sprawling Virginia manor that would witness chaos disguised as glamour. These houses served as stages for the rise of America's most powerful political dynasty. But they also witnessed something else: a pattern of loss so relentless, so statistically improbable, that observers began using a word that serious historians avoid: curse. Between 1944 and 1999, the Kennedy family experienced more violent deaths, more public scandals, more devastating accidents than any comparable American dynasty. Plane crashes, assassinations, drownings, overdoses, suicides, skiing accidents. Each tragedy connected somehow to these properties, either occurring at them, announced within their walls, or mourned in rooms designed for celebration. How does one family accumulate such concentrated misfortune? What machinery operated behind the white clapboard facades and manicured lawns? And who actually paid for this dynasty, not just with money, but with their lives, their sanity, their futures sacrificed to maintain an image that was always more facade than foundation? The Kennedy estates represent more than architectural history or political biography. They're evidence. Case studies in what happens when ambition becomes religion, when image matters more than reality, when the cost of maintaining a dynasty exceeds what any family can sustain. Stand outside the Hyannisport compound today, and you see postcard perfection. But the houses remember everything. Before understanding what the estates became, you need to understand what Joseph Patrick Kennedy intended them to be. 1928 Kennedy is 40 years old, wealthy through methods that would remain perpetually murky, and absolutely determined to transform his family into American aristocracy. Not inherited aristocracy. America theoretically rejects such things, but manufactured aristocracy. Wealth plus strategy, plus relentless ambition equals dynasty. He's made millions through several sources: stock, market speculation using techniques that would later be restricted or banned outright, film production in Hollywood, running studios, and allegedly maintaining relationships with actresses that scandalized even permissive California society. And according to persistent rumors never proven in court, but never fully dispelled, bootlegging during Prohibition, moving illegal alcohol with efficiency that suggested organized operations. Kennedy always denied the bootlegging allegations. The denials convinced no one who watched his fortune accumulate with suspicious speed during the exact years when fortunes could be made most quickly through illegal liquor. But by 1928, the source of his money matters less than what he intends to do with it. He's wealthy. That's insufficient. He wants respectability. He wants his family to matter across generations. And he understands something fundamental about American class structure. Location signals legitimacy more effectively than bank balances. The right address opens doors that money alone can't unlock. Cape Cod represents where Protestant elite families summer. Names like Lodge and Saltonstall, families whose American roots extend back centuries, who own estates along Massachusetts' coastline as naturally as they own shares in Boston banks and seats on corporate boards. They don't welcome newcomers, especially not Irish Catholics, especially not those who made fortunes recently through ventures that respectable people don't discuss. Kennedy doesn't wait for welcome. In 1928, he purchases property in Hyannisport, 6 waterfront acres containing not 1 residence, but 3. The main house where he and his wife Rose will establish headquarters, plus 2 smaller structures positioned strategically on the same parcel. This isn't random acquisition. Kennedy is planning decades ahead. His children, he and Rose, already have 5, with 4 more coming, will grow up here. When they marry, they won't scatter to establish independent households. They'll occupy those additional houses. The compound will keep the family consolidated under his control, his vision, his unrelenting drive toward power. The architecture announces careful calculation. White clapboard siding, green shutters, porches facing Nantucket Sound. Classic New England aesthetic that looks like it could have existed for generations, though the structures are relatively recent construction. Kennedy understands that true wealth in WASP America doesn't announce itself through ostentation. It whispers through understatement. His compound will look like old money, even though the money financing it is aggressively new. The location itself provides multiple advantages. Close enough to Boston for business access, Kennedy can monitor his operations, maintain political connections, conduct financial transactions. Far enough for privacy family matters can remain family matters, away from Boston's gossip machinery that never stops processing Irish Catholic newcomers. But most importantly, the waterfront setting provides the visual backdrop Kennedy requires. If his children grow up summering on Cape Cod like Protestant elite families, they'll appear indistinguishable from Protestant elite families. Background can be manufactured through correct geographic staging. Rose Kennedy takes charge of household management. She's daughter of Boston's mayor, John "Honey" Fitzgerald, so she understands politics, image construction, the performance required to transform ambition into achievement. She'll raise their 9 children according to principles that blend Catholic discipline with ruthless competition. Daily Mass, prayers, strict rules governing appearance and public behavior. But underneath the religious structure, constant competition. Touch football games on the compound lawn aren't casual recreation. They're contests with winners and losers, with children learning early that Kennedys don't accept defeat. Sailing races from the private dock are a leisure activity. They read tests of skill and determination where coming in second means failing. Even dinner table conversation operates as competitive debate, with children required to defend positions or face dismissal from serious discussion. Kennedy believes wealth without power is meaningless, and power in America flows through politics. His children will enter public service. They'll win elections. They'll reshape the country according to Kennedy vision. A compound is where that training begins. But what the photographs never show, what the carefully staged images of the family sailing and playing football deliberately exclude, is the machinery required to maintain this fantasy. The Hyannisport compound employs a permanent staff of at least 15 to 20 people during summer season. Their names mostly don't survive in popular histories. They exist in payroll records, in employment documentation, in Social Security files, but not in the photographs that define how Americans remember the Kennedy family. Housekeepers maintaining 3 residences that must appear perpetually pristine. Not just clean magazine ready, because photographers arrive without warning, and every image must reinforce the Dynasty's visual brand. Cooks preparing meals for a family whose size fluctuates as children grow. Marry, produce their own offspring. Industrial-scale food preparation disguised as domestic arrangement, with kitchens operating like small restaurants during peak gathering periods. Groundskeepers maintaining 6 acres of waterfront property where every visible surface must suggest effortless perfection. Lawns manicured to precise heights. Gardens blooming on schedule. The dock maintained for constant use. Equipment stored invisibly so guests see only beauty, never the labor that creates it. A sailing instructor teaching Kennedy children skills that will photograph well and demonstrate athletic competence required for their public image. Security staff, never called that, but functioning as such, monitoring access to property that's simultaneously private residence and semi-public political headquarters. These workers earn wages typical for domestic service in upper-class households. Housekeepers approximately $30 to $40 weekly in late 1920s money. Groundskeepers slightly less. Cooks commanding slightly higher compensation due to specialized skills. Compare those wages to Kennedy's income millions annually from diverse sources, and the mathematics create cognitive dissonance. The people maintaining the fantasy that photographs as effortless superiority earn in a year what the family spends on a single sailing vacation. But the real cost isn't measured in wages. It's measured in what service requires. Subordinating your life to someone else's vision, maintaining their image while remaining invisible yourself, enabling their success while accepting that your own aspirations matter less than their convenience. The compound operates on a principle that wealthy families rarely state explicitly, but always enforce rigorously. Some people exist to serve. Others exist to be served. The boundary between these categories is fixed, unquestionable, and must never be acknowledged directly. Kennedy children grow up surrounded by adults who clean their rooms, prepare their meals, maintain their environment, yet they're trained to treat these adults as functional components rather than humans with comparable complexity. Not through deliberate cruelty, through systematic invisibility. The staff who make the compound function aren't included in family photographs, aren't mentioned in newspaper coverage, aren't considered when histories describe the Kennedy family's formative years. They're the invisible infrastructure, and like all infrastructure, they only become noticeable when they fail. One compound isn't sufficient for Kennedy's vision. New England summers provide the right backdrop, but winters require different staging, somewhere warm, somewhere that signals not just wealth, but the specific kind of wealth that allows escape from seasonal constraints that bind ordinary people. In 1933, Kennedy purchases property in Palm Beach, Florida. Not just any Palm Beach property, an oceanfront estate at 1095 North Ocean Boulevard that announces arrival through sheer scale. The house contains approximately 15,000 square feet across 2 stories, with architecture that mirrors neither New England restraint nor Florida tropical aesthetic, but instead suggests Mediterranean villa transplanted to American coastline. White stucco exterior, red tile roof, arched windows and doorways, courtyards that create semi-private outdoor spaces. A swimming pool still relatively uncommon in private residences during the 1930s, announcing that the Kennedy family possesses resources for luxuries most Americans can only imagine. The property costs approximately $100,000 in $1,933, equivalent to roughly $2.3 million today. Not the most expensive estate in Palm Beach, but substantial enough to signal serious wealth rather than merely comfortable prosperity. Palm Beach itself represents where America's wealthiest families winter. The Vanderbilts, the Phippses, the Posts families, whose fortunes dwarf Kennedy's, whose social acceptance he desires, but will never fully achieve despite his wealth. They tolerate his presence in Palm Beach, while ensuring he understands the distinction between being admitted and being welcomed. Kennedy doesn't particularly care about their feelings. He's purchasing geographic proximity to power. When his children vacation in Palm Beach alongside children of America's wealthiest families, they'll form connections, absorb attitudes, develop relationships that will prove useful when they enter politics decades later. The Palm Beach estate operates differently than the Hyannisport compound. Hyannisport functions as training ground competitive, intense, focused on building toughness through constant contest. Palm Beach functions as showcase relaxed, elegant, designed to demonstrate that the Kennedy family belongs among America's elite, regardless of Irish Catholic origins that would have excluded them a generation earlier. Rose Kennedy furnishes the house with careful attention to signaling correct taste. Not ostentatious, that would mark them as nouveau rich, the exact designation they're working to escape, but substantial enough to demonstrate they understand what quality means and possess resources to acquire it. The staff required to operate the Palm Beach estate exceeds even Hyannisport numbers. A house this size requires full-time housekeeping staff, multiple cooks because entertaining happens frequently and must achieve standards that match neighboring estates, groundskeepers maintaining tropical landscaping that wilts without constant attention in Florida humidity, pool maintenance requiring specialized knowledge, and crucially, different staff than those employed at Hyannisport. The Kennedy family moves seasonally, summers in Massachusetts, winters in Florida, but the staff doesn't follow. Each property maintains separate permanent employees, meaning the family pays for year-round labor at both locations, regardless of whether they're present. This redundancy costs approximately $30,000 to $40,000 annually across both estates during the 1930s, when average American family income hovers around $1,500 yearly. Calculate that ratio. The Kennedy family as household staff expenses alone exceed the total annual income of 25 to 30 average American families. The mathematics work because Kennedy's fortune continues expanding. Stock market investments, business ventures, and according to those persistent rumors, continued involvement in industries operating at the edges of legality. But underneath the expanding wealth and growing political influence, something else accumulates: pressure. Between 1915 and 1932, Rose Kennedy gives birth to 9 children. Joseph Jr., born 1915, John, born 1917, Rosemary, born 1918, Kathleen, born 1920, Eunice, born 1921, Patricia, born 1924, Robert, born 1925, Zhang, born 1928, Edward, born 1932, 9 children in 17 years. Each one assigned roles within Joe Kennedy's vision for Dynasty before they were old enough to consent to those roles. Joseph Jr. is the heir apparent, the firstborn son who will fulfill his father's ultimate ambition, becoming President of the United States. Everything about Joe Jr.'s upbringing points toward this destiny. He's given slightly more attention, slightly more investment, slightly more pressure than his siblings, because he carries the weight of his father's unfulfilled political aspirations. John, always called Jack, is the backup. Second son, intelligent but physically fragile with health problems that plague him from childhood. He's expected to support Joe Jr.'s political career, perhaps serving in Congress, while his brother occupies the White House. The daughters receive different training. Marriage to men who can advance Kennedy interests, hosting that enhances the family's social position, support roles that keep dynasty machinery operating without competing for spotlight. Robert and Edward are too young during the 1930s to have defined roles yet, but they'll eventually inherit the dynasty's continuation once Joe Jr. achieves his presidential destiny. This is how Kennedy thinks: multi-generational planning where individual desires matter less than collective advancement. The compound becomes the classroom where this ideology is taught. Every competition, sailing, football, tennis, debates at dinner, reinforces the same lesson. Winning is mandatory. Losing is unacceptable, and Kennedys must dominate whatever arena they enter. Joe Kennedy personally oversees much of this training when he's present at the compound, though his business interests frequently require absence. He's not a warm father by conventional standards. Affection must be earned through achievement. Love is conditional on performance. Rose provides the Catholic structure, daily mass, religious instruction, moral framework, but she also enforces her husband's competitive philosophy. She keeps detailed records of each child's accomplishments, maintaining files that document academic achievements, athletic victories, social successes. This sounds like attentive parenting until you realize she's creating performance metrics, quantifying her children's lives according to measures that will determine their value within dynasty logic. What doesn't get measured, discussed, or acknowledged? The cost of constant competition on children's mental health. The pressure of carrying parental ambitions that dwarf any individual's capacity. The impossibility of winning when the standards for success keep escalating regardless of achievement. Rosemary Kennedy provides the clearest evidence of what happens when dynasty logic encounters human limitation. Born in 1918, She experiences developmental challenges from early childhood. The exact nature of her condition remains debated. Some accounts suggest intellectual disability. Others describe mental illness. Still others indicate she functioned relatively normally until her early 20s. What's clear? She doesn't fit the Kennedy template of relentless achievement and competitive success. For years, the family manages this through concealment. Rosemary appears at public events, but doesn't speak extensively. She's photographed, but not interviewed. The family presents her as shy rather than struggling. But by 1941, as Joe Jr. and Jack begin their political ascents and the family's public profile intensifies, Rosemary becomes a liability in Joe Kennedy's calculation. She's 23 years old. Her behavior has become erratic, possibly due to the stress of maintaining appearances she can't sustain. She's experiencing mood swings, possibly attempting to assert independence that the family's controlling structure doesn't accommodate. In November 1941, Joe Kennedy makes a decision that will haunt the family for decades. He authorizes a lobotomy. The lobotomy is performed at George Washington University Hospital by Dr. Walter Freeman, who pioneered the procedure in America despite its experimental nature and devastating track record. The operation involves inserting instruments through holes drilled in Rosemary's skull, then destroying portions of her brain tissue that supposedly caused her problematic behaviors. It fails catastrophically. Rosemary emerges from the procedure incapacitated, unable to walk without assistance, speech reduced to fragments, cognitive function demolished to the level where she requires permanent institutional care. Joe Kennedy has destroyed his daughter's mind in an attempt to manage the family's image. He doesn't acknowledge this publicly. Instead, Rosemary disappears from family appearances. She's moved to St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Wisconsin, where she spent the rest of her life, 64 more years, in institutional care. The family doesn't visit frequently. Rose doesn't see her daughter for 20 years after the lobotomy. The other Kennedy children are told vague stories about Rosemary's condition, without full disclosure of what their father authorized. This establishes a pattern that will define Kennedy family crisis management. Conceal. Control the narrative. Never admit error. Maintain the facade regardless of what truth it requires burying. The lobotomy costs approximately $200, a 1941 trivial expense for the family. But the real cost can't be quantified. A young woman has entire future stolen by a father who valued Dynasty reputation over his daughter as humanity. Rosemary Kennedy becomes the invisible proof that the compound is competitive pressure destroys those who can't withstand it. But she won't be the last. December 1941. Pearl Harbor forces America into World War II, and the Kennedy sons immediately see opportunity. Not for service alone, though they'll serve, but for the political capital that military heroism provides. Joe Kennedy has trained them to understand. Everything is strategy. Everything advances dynasty interests, even warfare. Joseph Jr. joins the Navy, becoming a bomber pilot, flying dangerous missions over Europe. He's brave, skilled, and absolutely determined to accumulate the kind of heroic record that will launch his political career after the war. Jack Kennedy joins the Navy as well, eventually commanding PT-109 in the Pacific Theater. His service will become legendary, the small boat rammed by a Japanese destroyer, the heroic survival and rescue of his crew, though the full story is more complicated than the version that will be marketed during his political campaigns. Robert is too young for World War II service, still in school during the conflict. Edward is barely a teenager, watching his older brothers go to war while remaining behind at the compound with his parents and sisters. The estates function differently during wartime. Hyannisport and Palm Beach can't maintain their pre-war social calendars when America is rationing and sacrificing. The compound still operates, but the elaborate entertaining ceases. Staff numbers decrease as workers leave for war industries or military service. For the first time, the Kennedy estates feel less like command centers and more like ordinary wealthy residences waiting for the war to end and normal life to resume. But normal life won't resume. August 12, 1944. Joseph Kennedy Jr. volunteers for an extremely dangerous mission, piloting a bomber loaded with explosives that will be remotely detonated over German targets. The plan requires him to fly the aircraft to altitude, arm the explosives, then parachute out before remote controllers guide it to the target. Something goes wrong. The explosives detonate prematurely while Joe Jr. is still aboard. The aircraft disintegrates mid-air over the English Channel. No body is recovered, just fragments scattered across water and coastline. The heir to the Kennedy dynasty, the son who is supposed to become president, dead at 29. News reaches the compound at Hyannis Port, where the family has gathered. Rose Kennedy receives the telegram in the living room, where family photographs show her sons in Navy uniforms, smiling, confident, alive. She reads the words announcing Joe Jr.'s death, and something in the compound's atmosphere shifts permanently. This isn't theoretical tragedy anymore. Not someone else's family. Not a possibility to be managed through planning and control. This is loss that can't be fixed, erased, or overcome through Kennedy determination. Joe Kennedy's response is immediate and revealing. Jack will now become president. Not, the family will grieve. Not, perhaps we should reconsider political ambitions. But the dynasty requires a president. Joe Jr. is gone. Therefore, Jack inherits the role. Jack Kennedy, still recovering from injuries sustained when PT-109 sank, still dealing with chronic health problems that should disqualify him from the political career his father now demands, has no choice but to accept the transfer of destiny. The first death has occurred. The curse that people will later name is beginning its count. But in 1944, standing in the compound where Joe Jr. learned to sail and compete and prepare for a future that will never arrive, no one yet recognizes the pattern that's forming. They think this is isolated tragedy. They're wrong. The Virginia Manor, while the compound serves as dynasty headquarters, the Kennedy family acquires a third major property in the late 1950s, Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia. This estate tells a different story than Hyannis Port or Palm Beach. It's not about dynasty building or social positioning. It is about what happens when the second generation attempts to create their own version of Kennedy family life. The property covers approximately 6 acres smaller than the Hyannis Port compound, but substantial for suburban Virginia. A Georgian-style brick mansion containing roughly 13,000 square feet, with multiple bedrooms, formal entertaining spaces, and grounds designed for the kind of active family life that defines Kennedy identity. Robert F. Kennedy purchases Hickory Hill in 1957 for approximately $200,000. He and his wife Ethel will raise 11 children here, one more than Joe and Rose produced, as if competing with the previous generation's fertility. The estate quickly becomes legendary for chaos barely contained by wealth. Children everywhere. Dogs, horses, other animals acquired on impulse. Swimming pool that hosts parties where guests are routinely pushed in fully clothed. Touch football games that occasionally result in injuries requiring hospital visits. The same competitive atmosphere that defined Hyannisport, but now applied to a new generation without the discipline Rose Kennedy imposed. Ethel Kennedy runs the household, or more accurately, presides over controlled chaos that works because sufficient. Staff exists to manage what appears from outside as spontaneous family fun. The staff required at Hickory Hill exceeds typical wealthy family employment. Live-in nannies caring for 11 children whose ages span nearly 2 decades. Housekeepers maintaining a mansion that sustains constant use and abuse from children, animals, and endless entertaining. Groundskeepers managing 6 acres that include landscaping, pool, tennis court, and areas designated for children's activities. Cooks preparing meals for a family whose size and appetites require institutional-scale operations. Security personnel who become increasingly necessary as Robert Kennedy's political prominence attracts both admirers and threats. Total household staff, approximately 20 to 25 people during peak years. These workers earn wages typical for domestic service in wealthy Washington area households during the 1960s, perhaps $60 to $100 weekly, depending on position and responsibility. Better than many service jobs, but nowhere near sufficient to afford anything resembling the lifestyle they enable for their employers. The mathematics at Hickory Hill mirror the mathematics at Hyannisport, a family's consumption of resources, space, and human labor that exceeds what hundreds of ordinary families utilize, all in service of maintaining an image of effortless superiority that photographs well for political campaigns. But Hickory Hill serves another function that becomes clear only in retrospect. It's where the next generation of Kennedy tragedies will incubate. Between 1963 and 1968, a Kennedy family experiences losses that transform the estates from symbols of power into monuments to grief. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. John F. Kennedy, now president, having fulfilled the destiny his father transferred to him after Joe Jr.'s death, is assassinated while riding in a motorcade. Shot in the head, dying almost instantly, his presidency ending after less than 3 years. News reaches the compound at Hyannisport, where Joe Kennedy Sr. has been living since suffering a massive stroke in 1961. That left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. The father who built the dynasty now sits immobile, unable to communicate his grief, watching his life's work collapse. Rose Kennedy, now 73, receives the news with the stoic Catholic discipline she's maintained throughout her life. She attends Mass. She prays. She instructs her children on how to behave publicly during mourning. Image management continues even through assassination. The compound fills with family, friends, politicians, journalists, all gathering at the place that represents Kennedy identity. But something has changed fundamentally. This isn't a training ground anymore. It's becoming a memorial. June 6, 1968, Los Angeles, California. Robert F. Kennedy, now pursuing his own presidential campaign, seemingly destined to continue the dynasty despite his brother's murder, is shot immediately after winning the California primary. He dies 26 hours later, never regaining consciousness. Hickory Hill, which had been staging ground for another Kennedy presidency, becomes instead another site of impossible grief. Ethel Kennedy, pregnant with the couple's 11th child, now faces raising that enormous family alone while maintaining the competitive Kennedy atmosphere without Robert's presence. The mathematics of tragedy have become statistically absurd. 3 Kennedy sons, 2 assassinated, 1 killed in military service. The probability of this occurring randomly is so low that observers begin using that word, curse. Joe Kennedy Sr. dies in November 1969, still partially paralyzed from his 1961 stroke, having witnessed the destruction of his dynasty's leadership. The man who built the compound, who purchased the Palm Beach estate, who planned multi-generational political dominance, he dies knowing that 2 of his sons were murdered, and his daughter remains institutionalized from the lobotomy he authorized. The estates remain in family hands, but their purpose has shifted from creation to commemoration. By the 1970s, the Hyannisport compound has become something unprecedented, a functioning family residence that is also a living memorial to tragedy. The main house where Joe and Rose raised 9 children now contains mostly empty bedrooms. Joe Jr.'s room, Jack's room, Bobby's room, each preserved with some of the original inhabitants' possessions, creating shrine-like spaces within a residence still occupied by living family members. Rose Kennedy, now widowed, having survived her husband, 3 of her sons, and watching her eldest daughter live in institutional care maintains her routine with mechanical precision. Daily mass, walks on the beach, meals at scheduled times. The same discipline that organized her children's upbringing now structures her grief. But she can't control what the compound has become in public imagination. Tourists drive past slowly, photographing the white clapboard houses from the road. Tour boats pass offshore, guides pointing out which building is which, narrating abbreviated versions of Kennedy history that sanitize the darkness into digestible tragedy. The compound becomes a stop on Cape Cod tourist itineraries, right alongside Provincetown galleries and Chatham lighthouses. Except unlike those attractions, this one remains occupied. The Kennedys are still there, living inside their own memorial. Edward Kennedy Teddy, the youngest, the last surviving son, inherits the political dynasty's continuation by default. Not because he was trained for presidency from childhood like Joe Jr., or because destiny was transferred to him like Jack, but because he's the only one left. And in 1969, Teddy provides the most Kennedy of all disasters. Chappaquiddick. July 18, 1969. Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts. Edward Kennedy attends a party at a cottage near the compound. He leaves around 11:15 p.m. with Mary Jo Kopechne, a 28-year-old campaign worker who'd worked on Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. Kennedy's car, driving on unfamiliar roads in darkness, misses a turn and plunges off Dyke Bridge into Pausha Pond. The vehicle overturns, landing on its roof in approximately 8 feet of water. Kennedy escapes. Kopechne doesn't. What happens next defines Kennedy family crisis management. Kennedy doesn't report the accident immediately. He walks past several houses with lights on, past a fire station, back to his hotel. He doesn't call police until the next morning, approximately 10 hours after the crash, and only after Kopechne's body has been discovered by fishermen. The official explanation: Kennedy was in shock, confused, not thinking clearly. The unavoidable questions: why didn't he immediately seek help? Why did he pass multiple opportunities to report an accident where someone might still be saved? Why did his first calls go to family political advisors rather than emergency services? Kopechne's autopsy suggests she might have survived for hours in an air pocket inside the submerged vehicle, slowly suffocating while Kennedy consulted lawyers about managing the political fallout. He pleads guilty to leaving the scene of an accident, receives a 2-month suspended sentence. His political career survives, though presidential ambitions die at Chappaquiddick. And Mary Jo Kopechne, invisible in Kennedy family histories, except as the name associated with their scandal, pays the real price. Her life ends at 28 because she accepted a ride from the wrong person on the wrong night. The compound that launched dynasties, that trained presidents, has now produced another death. This one through negligence rather than curse, through selfish calculation rather than random tragedy. But the pattern continues regardless of cause. We need to acknowledge something the Kennedy hagiographies consistently omit. The estates weren't just family residences or political headquarters. They were machines that consumed human lives in multiple ways, some dramatic, some quiet, all systematic. The staff who maintained these properties for decades, their names don't appear in Kennedy family histories. They're not included in the photographs that define American memory of Camelot. They exist in payroll records and employment files, documented with the same impersonal precision as utility expenses or property maintenance costs. What happened to the housekeeper who cleaned Joe Jr.'s room after news of his death arrived? How did she feel removing his possessions, preparing the space to become a memorial rather than a living person's bedroom? What happened to the groundskeeper who maintained the Hyannisport lawn where Kennedy children played touch football, who watched them grow from competitors to politicians to assassination victims? What happened to the cook at Hickory Hill who prepared meals for 11 Kennedy children, who witnessed the chaos that Ethel encouraged, who cleaned up after parties where privileged children learned that rules didn't apply to them? These workers gave decades to maintaining Kennedy fantasies. They enabled the image of effortless superiority that required enormous invisible effort. They subordinated their lives to dynasty building that benefited them exactly not at all, except through paychecks that were generous by working class standards, but absurdly small compared to the wealth they served. And when tragedy struck, when telegrams announced deaths, when funerals filled the compound, when scandal required crisis management, those workers remained invisible. Present but not acknowledged, necessary but not valued. The estates consumed their labor the way they consumed everything, efficiently, continuously, without reflection on cost or consequence. But there's another category of invisible people, the women destroyed by Kennedy men. The Kennedy men's treatment of women establishes another pattern, less lethal but equally destructive. Joe Kennedy's affairs were notorious, conducted openly enough that Rose certainly knew but maintained her Catholic dignity by never acknowledging publicly. The most famous, his relationship with Gloria Swanson during his Hollywood years, which he managed simultaneously with his marriage and his business interests in her films. Jack Kennedy's sexual behavior became legendary hundreds of women during his presidency alone, according to accounts from Secret Service agents and White House staff. Marilyn Monroe most famously, but also staffers, actresses, socialites, anyone available and willing. His marriage to Jackie existed as political arrangement that she endured with pharmaceutical assistance and shopping expeditions. Bobby Kennedy maintained slightly better public image, but still reportedly had affairs that demonstrated the family as approach to marriage. Women exist for dynasty purposes, producing heirs, managing image, and for male pleasure, affairs conducted with minimal discretion. Teddy Kennedy's behavior matched his brother's multiple affairs. Public drunkenness, the Chappaquiddick disaster, where his actions directly caused a woman's death. These weren't isolated incidents. They represented systematic devaluation of women as humans with comparable worth to Kennedy men. The estates enabled this behavior structurally. Multiple properties provided geographic separation that facilitated affairs. Staff signed NDAs or faced job loss if they discussed family behavior. The family's wealth and political power meant most women couldn't risk speaking publicly about mistreatment. And the women who did suffer, whether through affairs, through being discarded after serving purposes, through watching their lives become subplots in Kennedy men's stories, they remain mostly nameless in popular histories. Mary Jo Kopechne gets remembered because she died. How many women suffered damage that didn't kill them, and therefore don't merit even footnote mentions? By 1999, the Kennedy family has experienced Joseph Jr., killed in military service, 1,944. Kathleen, died in plane crash, 1,948. John F. Kennedy, assassinated, 1,963. Robert F. Kennedy, assassinated, 1,968. David Kennedy, Bobby's son, overdose death, 1,984. Michael Kennedy, Bobby's son, skiing accident death, 1997. John F. Kennedy Jr., plane crash with wife and sister-in-law, 1999. Plus numerous non-fatal disasters. Teddy's plane crash, 1964. Teddy Jr.'s cancer and leg amputation, 1973. Various drug addictions, multiple scandals, marriages destroyed, careers ruined. The statistical probability of this much tragedy in one family defies reasonable calculation. Is it curse? No, curses aren't real. And explaining Kennedy tragedies through supernatural causes lets everyone avoid examining the real machinery. What explains the pattern? Reckless, risk-taking encouraged by competitive family culture that taught winning mattered more than caution. Substance abuse enabled by wealth that made consequences disappear. Political enemies who actually did target some family members. But mostly, The illusion that wealth and power provide immunity from consequences, leading to behaviors that invite disaster. The estates didn't cause these tragedies, but they created the environment where dynasty logic mattered more than individual safety, where image management took precedence over addressing problems, where maintaining the Kennedy brand required sacrificing Kennedy humanity. The Hyannisport compound remains in family hands, occupied by various Kennedy descendants and relatives. Tourists still drive past. Photographers still capture the white clapboard from maximum legal distance. The houses still face Nantucket Sound, though the family members who learned to sail from that dock are mostly dead or elderly. Rose Kennedy died in 1995 at age 104, having survived her husband and 4 of her 9 children. The woman who managed the compound's daily operations for 7 decades, who maintained Catholic discipline through endless tragedy, who never publicly acknowledged that maybe the dynasty wasn't worth its cost. The Palm Beach estate sold out of family ownership in the 1990s, purchased by someone who saw it as impressive property rather than historical monument. Hickory Hill sold in 2009 for $8.25 million. The new owners encountered a house that had been beautiful once, but now showed decades of deferred maintenance. Damage from 11 Kennedy children and countless animals, systems that barely functioned because nobody wanted to invest in maintaining a memorial. What remains? Photographs. Endless photographs of Kennedy family gatherings, sailing races, touch football games, political campaigns. Images that show beautiful people in beautiful locations living beautiful lives. Those images are real. The beauty existed, but so did everything the photographs excluded. The staff working invisibly, the women damaged systematically, the children crushed by dynasty pressure, the tragedies that accumulated with probability that suggested something deeply wrong. The estates witnessed both. The beauty and the cost. Stand outside the Hyannisport compound today, and you can almost believe the photographs. The houses look like they should contain happy families. The lawn suggests innocent competition. The dock invites sailing adventures that end in triumph rather than tragedy. But the compound remembers everything. It remembers Joe Jr.'s room the day news arrived of his death. It remembers Jack's room after Dallas. It remembers Bobby's room after Los Angeles. It remembers empty spaces multiplying as the dynasty consumed its own children. It remembers Rose Kennedy walking the beach alone at 80, 90, 100 years old, outliving everyone, carrying grief that Catholic discipline couldn't fully suppress. It remembers staff who maintained the fantasy while earning wages that kept them dependent. It remembers women who discovered too late that Kennedy men treated them as disposable. It remembers children raised to believe they were superior, then destroyed by the pressure that belief created. The Kennedy estates don't teach us about curses. They teach us about cost. Every dynasty requires fuel. The Kennedys burned through human lives, their own and others, with efficiency that seems almost deliberate in retrospect. Not through conscious malice, but through systematic prioritizing of dynasty over humanity. Joe Kennedy wanted to create American aristocracy. He succeeded. But the cost exceeded what any family could sustain. 3 sons dead, 1 daughter destroyed by lobotomy, countless others damaged by expectations that treated individual human lives as assets to be deployed in service of collective ambition. The estates still stand, some of them, beautiful properties in desirable locations, but they're monuments now. Evidence of what happens when ambition becomes religion, when image matters more than reality, when dynasty logic encounters the mathematics of human limitation. 3 estates, 3 generations. Tragedy that defied probability but followed logic. The houses witnessed everything. They remember what the photographs exclude, and they offer one final lesson. No amount of wealth, power, or careful planning can protect you from the consequences of treating human lives, including your own families, as components in a machine designed to manufacture dynasty. The machine always breaks eventually. Usually it breaks by consuming the very people it was supposed to elevate. In 2024, the Kennedy compound still belongs to the family, but it's functionally a museum that people occasionally sleep in. The main house contains the same furniture rows selected decades ago. Joe Jr. as sailing trophies still occupy shelves. Photographs cover walls, images of people now dead, moments now history. A family that existed briefly at the center of American power before centrifugal forces tore it apart. A few Kennedy descendants still visit, still sail from the dock, still play touch football on the lawn, though with less intensity than their grandparents demanded. The tourists still drive past, still take photographs, still wonder what really happened to this family that seemed to have everything. The answer is visible if you look past the white clapboard and green shutters. They had everything except the wisdom to understand that everything has a cost, and they never stopped paying it.